My name is Weizmann Hamilton. I'm the General Secretary of the Marxist Worker Party, the South African affiliate of the Committee for the Workers International.
So we're here today in Johannesburg. There have been power outages, power shedding, where the power has gone off in Johannesburg. This has been going on for some time. And also in Durban, there was a power shutdown for 17 hours. I mean, obviously, the crisis of capitalism and the whole government, ANC, is being exposed more and more to the South African people. Why don't we talk about immediately, the crisis now of power and why the South African government can't supply power to people on a regular basis in one of the richest countries of the world?
It derives ultimately from the commitment of the ANC, not just to preserve capitalism as agreed in the negotiated settlement that culminated in the elections of 1994, but the adoption of the neoliberal growth, employment, and redistribution strategy imposed on the ANC without any democratic debate by a cabal within the ANC cabinet led by Thabo Mbeki with the support of Mandela in 1996. And what followed from that was the adoption of the prevailing neoliberal orthodoxies in global capitalism, which in the first instance led to the ANC completely abandoning the Freedom Charter, which, even though it wasn't a socialist document, contained clauses for the nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy, which, were it to have been attempted, would have required on the part of the ANC to mobilize the working class. But the working class would not have agreed to simply remove what they incorrectly referred to as white monopoly capital and install a black capitalist class as their new slave masters.
Some people who now say that under apartheid there were better conditions of transportation, of electricity, other things than today in South Africa.
Well, what was there has deteriorated. But I think it would be wrong to say that the conditions under apartheid were better, because such social services as there were provided only for the white minority at the time.
The railways, a lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed through privatization. Isn't that the case?
Well, the irony of the whole situation is that to the extent that they've attempted privatization, that has not been a very great success. The reason that the ANC is only now attempting, through the new program of the dismantling of ESCOM into three separate transmission, distribution, and generation units.
And ESCOM is a national electrical grid.
Correct. ESCOM is the national energy provider, created even before apartheid, by the way, in the 1920s in the country. And they were warned, the ANC government, in the mid-90s, that unless the grid was upgraded, that there would be blackouts in 10 years. The government at the time was committed to the implementation of privatization and did not want to put ESCOM on the market, burdened with the debt it would be necessary to load ESCOM with in order to finance the expansion of the grid. And at the same time, electricity in South Africa was the cheapest in the world under ESCOM. That was not an attractive proposition for any potential buyers in the private sector.
They wanted a deregulated market.
That is what they proceeded to do. But the attempts to privatize ESCOM were unsuccessful. And the only way in which the black capitalist class, whose interests the ANC historically represents, was going to be able to fulfill its own mission to try and rise to the summits of the capitalist economy, was actually, ironically, to sabotage the process of privatization, keep it in state hands, take control of the appointments of senior positions in the state-owned enterprises as a whole, in order to ensure that contracts for supply of coal, for example, were directed to companies that were set up by the black capitalist class. So this is the irony, you see. What is described, I think, not completely accurately any longer, particularly after the Pala saga and the ANC conference that followed, the so-called radical economic transformation faction. They don't really mean it when they say that they're opposed to privatization. What they want is to parasite on the state, and for that they need to control government in order to deploy their cadres into strategic positions within the SOEs, to direct the tenders for the contracts of various things, repairs, coal supply, and so on and so forth, to their cronies, to the social forces that they represent. So, that shows that the language that is being used is really to deceive the masses when they talk about privatization. There's equally an attempt to deceive the working class masses on the part of the lobby that wants to accelerate the privatization process. Because what we have here is a competition, the established capitalist class, in whose hands the system was intended to remain in line with the outcome of the negotiations that took place at CODESA. It's not an accident that the property clause in the new constitution requires a 2/3 majority in order to change. In other words, it would have prevented, if the ANC had continued to adhere to the Freedom Charter, the ANC to implement the nationalization clauses, because for that you need a 2/3 majority within Parliament. So, in effect, what the Constitution does is to provide for a minority veto within Parliament itself. Even if the ANC had 66% in the first election and wanted to implement the nationalization clause, they wouldn't have been able to do so. But the ANC, representing the black capitalist class, was itself not inclined to raise in front of the working class the possibility that they could, through social mobilization and a general strike, take control of the commanding eyes of the economy, because that would have meant posing the question in front of the working class of the necessity for the abolition of capitalism, the very system into which they had wanted to be assimilated. So that is the reason that there was no problem with them ditching the Freedom Charter, and even the Reconstruction and Development Program, which was a mildly social democratic program adopted in place of the Freedom Charter, but ditched within 1996 in favor of the nakedly neoliberal GARE program that has resulted in savage cuts in social spending, in the relaxation of exchange control regulations, in the cutting of corporate tax from 52%, as it was under apartheid at the time, to 27% today. In other words, the consequence of the policies adopted by the ANC through the adoption of GARE meant that the tax revenues which they would have had to need in order to expand social services, at least to the same level as quality as it was for the white population, they denied it to themselves as a government. And as a consequence of the decline in tax revenue, a budget deficit opened. And they filled that budget deficit by borrowing on the international financial markets. The situation that we have today is where interest on the debt is the fastest rising item on the government's budget. So the ANC government is not in a position to solve any of the basic problems inside the country, because the requirement of neoliberalism is cuts on social spending in general. And at the moment, by the way, we're involved in one of the most important battles between organized labor and the government in the form of the public sector workers, who signed an agreement with government in 2018 for a 3-year period. And the government unilaterally decided not to pay the third leg of the increase in 2018, with the support of the Constitutional Court, which in this particular instance has dropped the mask of impartiality it relies upon to conceal that in the final analysis, the judiciary are merely the judicial wing of the ruling class inside the country, and condemned in the most trenchant language the claims of the workers for the increases that had been negotiated by way of the mandate that was given by the cabinet to the Minister for Public Service and Administration. And there's a sinister indication of the reasoning of the judge was that because a particular department within cabinet was overruled by the majority, that agreement was illegal and unconstitutional. What the Concord is saying to the working class in this country is that it is unconstitutional for you to enter into an agreement to lift yourself out of poverty. You have no such rights under capitalism. So to bring us to where we are with ESCOM, they were warned, upgrade the grid. They failed to do so from 1998 onwards, when they had even developed a white paper. The consequence of this was a deterioration of the grid over time, and blackouts starting occurring in 2008. What made matters worse is that the country hosted the World Cup in 2010, and to avoid the embarrassment of blackouts during the World Cup, they redirected the maintenance budget for the ESCOM grid to keep the lights going, aggravating the rate of deterioration of the coal-fired power stations, and so on and so forth. The efforts that were made by the private sector who have the capital through the so-called independent power producers, again concealing their real intentions of profiteering behind concern for the environment, by emphasizing that they want to switch to renewables. Those deals that were struck, they had bid windows to allow the private sector to bid for the contribution towards the grid. Between 2011, I think, and 2014, enough deals were signed in order to avert a possible blackout, but they were never approved because the coal lobby, which is now 50% black-owned, feared that the progress that they were making in switching the multi-decade agreements that characterized the coal industry under apartheid, and which they were succeeding now in getting switched to the black capitalist cars, would become meaningless. And therefore you have a situation where the interests of the two wings of the ANC and the two wings behind them of the capitalist class that they represented are reinforcing the devastating consequences on the economy of the blackouts, and of course on the conditions of the working class itself.